For decades, we've been taught one simple rule about air power. If you don't have a massive defense budget, you don't control the sky. Air dominance, we're told, belongs to superpowers, to the United States, to giant alliances like NATO, to countries that can spend trillions without blinking. But that belief just took a serious hit. Because in a world dominated by military giants, one small country quietly proved that size isn't the real source of power. Sweden, a nation of just over 10 million people. No empire, no global military footprint, no trillion-dollar defense machine. And yet, Sweden just did something NATO did not expect. Not by building the biggest jet, not by copying American designs, and not by spending itself into power. Instead, Sweden showed that independence itself can be a weapon. This isn't just a story about a fighter jet. The Gripen E is not being introduced here as a piece of hardware. It's a provocation, a challenge to the entire idea that modern air dominance must flow through Washington, massive alliances, and centralized control. Think about the imbalance for a moment. On one side, NATO, the most powerful military alliance in human history, backed by decades of integration, shared intelligence, and enormous budgets. On the other side, a neutral country that most people associate with furniture, snow, and staying out of wars. That's exactly why this matters. Because when a small neutral country starts forcing the world's largest alliance to rethink how air power actually works, something deeper is happening. Something structural is shifting. The uncomfortable question isn't whether Sweden built a good jet. The real question is this: how did a country that refused to depend on anyone create a fighter that exposed weaknesses in the most advanced Air Force system on Earth? And even more unsettling, what happens if Sweden isn't the last country to figure this out? That's where this story begins. To understand how Sweden pulled this off, you have to forget about jets for a moment and look at fear. Not panic, but long-term strategic fear. During the Cold War, Sweden sat in one of the most uncomfortable positions on the map. To the east, the Soviet Union. To the west, NATO. Two massive power blocks, both capable of swallowing smaller nations whole. Sweden chose neutrality, but neutrality didn't mean safety. It meant being alone if things went wrong. And Sweden understood something early that many countries ignored. Alliances are political. Survival is physical. If war broke out, no treaty could guarantee that help would arrive on time, or at all. So Sweden made a decision that shaped everything that followed. Never depend on another country for the tools needed to defend itself. That mindset became a doctrine. Not just build our own weapons, but control every layer of them. The aircraft, the radar, the software, the upgrades, the maintenance, the code itself. Because a jet you can't modify in wartime is not really yours. This is why Sweden never chased the biggest or flashiest designs. Instead, it focused on fighters that could operate from short roads, be serviced by small crews, and be updated quickly without asking permission. Every design choice came back to one question: can we survive alone? Over time, this philosophy hardened into what Sweden calls total defense sovereignty. It's the idea that defense doesn't stop at metal and engines. It extends into algorithms, data links, and decision-making authority. If another country controls your updates, they also control your limits. That's why the Gripen isn't an accident. It's not a reaction to the F-35 or a budget alternative. It's the final product of decades of planning under one core belief. Dependence is a vulnerability disguised as cooperation. The shift from theory to reality happened during a large multinational air exercise over Northern Europe. This wasn't a routine drill. It was designed to simulate a modern, high-intensity conflict, the kind NATO believes it is prepared to win. The setting was the Baltic region, crowded airspace, heavy electronic interference, multiple air forces operating at once. The United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and other NATO members brought their most advanced aircraft, surveillance planes, and command systems. Everything was connected. Everything was layered. Everything was supposed to work together. Sweden was invited, but not as a leader. Its role was limited and specific. Swedish Gripen E squadrons were asked to act as an independent force, operating outside NATO's main command structure. Their mission was simple on paper but difficult in practice: disrupt NATO operations without engaging in direct combat. In other words, Sweden was supposed to be a nuisance, not a problem. On paper, Sweden should have struggled. Fewer aircraft, no access to NATO's full intelligence network, no command authority. Against a system built for overwhelming coordination, Sweden looked outmatched before the exercise even began. Then the scenario went live. Within minutes, something unexpected happened. NATO's radar picture began to degrade. Communications lagged, data links flickered. Controllers noticed aircraft behaving in ways that didn't match their screens. Targets appeared, vanished, then reappeared somewhere else. The Gripens had slipped into the battle space. They weren't charging in. They weren't trying to outfly anyone. Instead, they moved quietly, exploiting gaps, confusing sensors, and disrupting the flow of information. NATO pilots started reacting to threats they couldn't clearly see or track. By the time NATO forces realized what was happening, the damage was already done. Multiple simulated assets had been neutralized. Command and control was fractured. Decision-making slowed. And the most alarming part was this: no missiles had been fired. In the post-exercise debriefs, NATO officials admitted something rarely said out loud. "We lost command and control faster than anticipated." That single sentence mattered more than any kill count, because it meant the world's most advanced air alliance hadn't been outgunned, it had been outthought. To understand what really happened in that exercise, you need to understand how modern air battles are actually fought. Today, wars in the sky are no longer decided by who flies faster or higher. They're decided by who controls information. Think of air combat like a group of people fighting in a dark room. The one who turns off the lights doesn't need to throw a punch. Everyone else is already at a disadvantage. That's electronic warfare. The Gripen E is built around this idea. At the center of it is Sweden's Orexis electronic warfare suite. Instead of trying to be invisible like traditional stealth aircraft, Gripen does something different. It makes the enemy blind. Orexis constantly listens. It detects radar signals, communication links, and tracking systems the moment they turn on. Then it responds, not by brute force, but by deception. Signals are distorted. False targets appear. Real targets shift position. The enemy's screen shows a picture that looks believable, but isn't true. This is what stealth without stealth looks like. NATO systems didn't fail because they were outdated. They failed because they were fed bad information. Radar operators thought they were seeing the full battlefield, when in reality they were reacting to ghosts. And here's the key point. Gripen didn't need to destroy anything. It didn't need to win dogfights or launch missiles. Once NATO's awareness collapsed, their advantage collapsed with it. You can have the best aircraft in the world, but if you don't know where the enemy is, or where your own forces are, you've already lost control. The psychological impact was even bigger than the technical one. Pilots and commanders depend on trust in their systems. When that trust breaks, hesitation creeps in. Decisions slow down. Confidence erodes. That's why this moment mattered so much. NATO wasn't beaten by speed, stealth, or firepower. It was beaten by lost awareness, and that raised a far more dangerous realization inside NATO headquarters. If a small, independent nation could do this. Here's the part that's often misunderstood. NATO was never afraid that Sweden might turn hostile. Sweden wasn't the threat. The idea Sweden proved was the threat. Modern NATO air power is built on integration, shared data, shared software, shared logistics. On the surface, this looks like strength, But underneath it lies a quiet reality. Control is centralized. Many advanced fighter jets, especially US-built platforms, rely on foreign approval for software updates, system modifications, and even certain operational permissions. If something needs to change during a conflict, you don't just flip a switch. You submit a request, you wait, and in war, waiting can be fatal. Sweden chose a different path. Gripen's software is written and controlled in Sweden. Its electronic systems are modular, meaning they can be adjusted or replaced quickly. If a new threat appears, Sweden doesn't need approval from another government to respond. Engineers can modify systems, upload changes, and adapt in real time. That flexibility creates something extremely dangerous for large alliances: unpredictability. A system that evolves slowly can be studied, countered, and contained. But a system that can change overnight becomes hard to pin down. NATO planners realized that Gripen wasn't powerful because it broke rules. It was powerful because it didn't depend on them. This is why one NATO analyst reportedly said the Gripen represents something more dangerous than an enemy jet. It represents freedom from dependence, and once that door is opened, it can't be closed again. Because the moment other countries start asking, why can't we control our own systems too? The problem stops being about Sweden and starts becoming about the entire structure NATO relies on. To see why this worried NATO so deeply, you have to understand how the alliance actually functions. NATO isn't just a military club. It's a system. And that system works because its members are tightly integrated, often through shared dependence on the same platforms, suppliers, and decision chains. Integration creates efficiency, but it also creates lock-in. When many countries rely on the same aircraft, the same software updates, the same logistics pipelines, coordination becomes easier. Everyone speaks the same technical language. Everyone plays by the same rules. That's how NATO maintains cohesion across dozens of nations. But Sweden's approach challenges that foundation. Gripen doesn't plug neatly into dependency-based integration. It can cooperate, but it doesn't need to, and that difference matters. Because if a country can opt out of reliance while still remaining effective, then dependence stops being a requirement and starts looking like a choice. Inside defense circles, the reaction was careful but tense. Official statements stayed polite. Exercises were labeled valuable learning experiences. But privately, concerns were clear. Some officials worried that if more European countries followed Sweden's model, NATO's core advantage, standardization through shared systems, could weaken. One quiet fear kept surfacing. What happens when unity is no longer enforced by necessity? If every nation controls its own software, upgrades, and tactics, coordination becomes harder. Power becomes decentralized. And centralized command, the thing NATO is built around, loses some of its grip. That's the uncomfortable question Sweden forced into the open. Is NATO strongest because its members are unified, or because they are dependent? And once that question is asked, it doesn't stay inside conference rooms. It spreads far beyond Sweden and far beyond Europe. Sweden's Gripen isn't just shaking up NATO, it's sending a message to the entire world. Smaller nations, often constrained by budgets, sanctions, or political pressures, are watching closely. For decades, advanced air power was a privilege reserved for a few superpowers. Want a fighter jet that could compete? You had to buy from the US, Russia, or Europe, and accept all the strings attached. Technology came with permission slips. Gripen changes that. It demonstrates that a nation doesn't need to be huge to be powerful. It can be sovereign, agile, and independent, even in the skies. For countries like Brazil, the Czech Republic, or others facing export restrictions, this is a blueprint for autonomy. Think of it like smartphones. Once only giant companies controlled the technology and the app stores, but now smaller developers can innovate on their own. Gripen is doing the same thing for air power. It's making sophisticated defense accessible to anyone willing to invest in independence. Autonomy has become a strategic currency. When a country can defend itself without political compromise, it gains freedom, both at home and in its foreign policy. Gripen doesn't just defend airspace, it defends choice. It defends the ability to act on your own terms, and the ripple effect is already visible. Countries are asking, if Sweden can do this, why can't we? If independence can create security, why rely on dependency? Gripen is no longer just a fighter jet. It's a symbol of a new era, one where air power isn't monopolized by superpowers, but available to nations that value sovereignty, flexibility, and foresight. It's the start of a global rethink, and the world is paying attention. At the end of the day, the story of the Gripen E isn't about defeating NATO or outmatching any single air force. It's about proving a deeper truth. Independence is possible and powerful. Sweden has quietly demonstrated that a small nation, with foresight and discipline, can rewrite the rules of modern warfare. The Gripen isn't just a fighter jet. It's a manifesto in metal, code, and radar pulses. It embodies the idea that a country doesn't need to spend endlessly or bow to external approvals to secure its skies. Flexibility, intelligence, and autonomy can outperform sheer size and budget. This is more than military pride. It's a strategic signal for the future. Nations watching the Gripen's success are reconsidering long-held dependencies. They're asking hard questions about alliances, export controls, and who really decides the limits of their defense capabilities. If one small country can challenge the assumptions that shaped decades of global security, who else is already preparing to do the same? In the modern world, the Gripen E reminds us that intelligence can defeat size, adaptability can defeat bureaucracy, and independence can defeat dependence. The era of superpower monopoly is ending, not with a bang, but with a quiet shift in mindset, one fighter jet at a time. And as the cameras stop rolling and the exercises conclude, one question remains. If Sweden can challenge the superpowers, who's next?